Do I have someone to open the meeting with the opening prayer this morning? Any volunteers? Okay, I'll do the morning prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. I just pray that you give them wisdom and guidance today for the benefit of our people across the Northwest Territories and to do our jobs as members of the Legislative Assembly and to work with everybody and to make good things happen. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay. Our next item under review, before we get started, members, I'd really like to give my condolences to Lucas family up in Sax Harbor for the loss of their mother, Samantha Lucas, and thoughts and prayers with the community of Sax Harbor. And please keep my riding of Nunavut in prayer, because yesterday we had our first positive cases of COVID-19 in the community. And I'd like to commend my nursing staff and the mayor and council and the Tut Community Corp and for working together to basically lock down the community until our contact tracing is done. And just pray for Nunavut, and I pray for everybody that's going through this in our communities across the Northwest Territories. So thoughts and prayers are with them, with everybody. So thank you for that. Our next item under review is the adoption of the agenda. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we have two presentations for our committee's priority of Northern business engagement. The first one will be with Mr. Jake Heron, representing the Northwest Territories Métis Nation. And then at 10:30 we will meet with Mr. Paul Gruner, President and CEO of Det'on Corporation. And then we have a few in-camera matters at the end. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Madam Clerk. Are there any other additions to changes to the agenda from any other of the members? Hearing none, hearing no changes on the agenda, can I have a motion to approve the agenda as presented? Mr. Johnson, thank you. Move the adoption agenda. Having reviewed the adoption of the adopted agenda, are there any declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none. Good day. Now I call this meeting of the Standing Committee of Economic Development and Environment to order. I'm Jackie Jacobson. I'm the MLA for Nunavut and chair of the committee. Today we'll be hearing from two presenters regarding committee's priority on Northern business engagement. Today's meeting will be being live streamed on the Assembly social media on channels. Due to COVID-19 situation in the NWT, we are following the Chief Public Health Officer's gathering restrictions in the Yellowknife, and the Legislative Assembly building is close to the public. The Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment will receive two presentations today. Each will be followed by a round of questions from the committee members. As a standing committee, it's our role to review any legislation introduced in the House. We also identify the priorities related to the economic development and environment in the NWT. These presentations are one segment of the public engagement the committee is undertaking to explore the ways the committee can support Northern businesses in the NWT. Committee has identified and priority to seek ways to increase responsiveness of the GNWT policies and the services that stimulate the diversity of Northern and particular Indigenous businesses. Committee will continue to engage the public on this matter in the future and welcomes any submissions and presentations. These can be arranged through the committee clerk. These presentations will be contribute to the committee work with the intention to make it recommendations to our government. I would like to remind all members, presenters, to direct all questions and comments to myself as the chair. and wait to be recognized before speaking to help us move smoothly through our meeting today. I'll now ask members to introduce themselves for the record.
Ron Bonner. Oh, sorry. Ron Bonner, MLA Det'on.
Good morning, Ryland Johnson. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Steve Noren, Tuna the Wilda.
Caitlin Cleveland, Cam Lake.
And thank you, Caitlin. Myself, Jackie Jacobson, MLA from Nunavut. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Jake Aaron, President or for the Métis Nation, to introduce himself and staff to proceed with his with your presentation. Jake, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the Legislative Assembly on this committee and related staff. There's only myself, James. My real name is James A. Heron, but I go by Jake. Most people know me as Jake. I'm the chief negotiator for the Northwest Territory Métis Nation, and I do additional things as a consultant, and this is one of my, I guess you can say, my other related duties to the Northwest Territory Métis Nation. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to make I didn't submit a written presentation for a number of reasons, but I do have some notes that I would like to convey to the committee. So, Mr. Chairman, shall we just go through the questions? And
yeah, Jake, whatever presentation you have, you could give it to us, and then we could, if any of my members have any questions, we'll go from there. Thank you. Okay. You could proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. In addressing the first question, what areas of the NWT economy are most urgent for the government to address? I guess I would like to, before getting to that question, I'd like to do a bit of a preamble, if you wish, in terms of your letter of July the 27th makes reference to seeking the views of businesses, particularly Indigenous businesses. And while the nation is not a business per se, it obviously represents Indigenous Métis businesses amongst its membership. So from that perspective, I guess you can say that in looking at the questions, it really, I guess, it does have a degree of ambiguity for me in terms of what is it that you really want to get at in terms of, when you talk about areas, are we talking about sectorally, or are we talking, what are we talking about? But I would like to say that in terms of, in broad terms, the economy needs human capacity to meaningfully pursue business and employment opportunities. There's a need to be clear, there needs to be clarity from the GMT about what role it wants to play in the community, especially development of human resources and businesses. I'd like to cite some labor statistics to demonstrate my point. Currently, statistical evidence that related to labor force activity by ethnicity and highest level of schooling from a winter of 2019 produced by the NWT Bureau of Statistics indicates that the NWT, for those 15 people 15 and older, there are 16,737 Indigenous people, with 10,709 being in the labor force. There were 8,422 employed and 2,268 unemployed. Thus, it resulted in a 64% participation rate and unemployment rate of 21.2%, an employment rate of 50.4%. Comparing to non-Indigenous population of those 50 and older, there were 18,303 people, of which 15,075 are in the labor force. There were 14,592 people employed and 483 unemployed. Thus, the participation rate for non-Indigenous people was 82.3%, with an unemployment rate of 3.2% and an overall employment rate of 79%. Comparing the Indigenous to the non-Indigenous people in the labor force by ethnicity, the highest level of schooling, overall there were substantial differences. For example, the unemployment rate for Indigenous people was 21% compared to 3.2% for non-Indigenous people. The employment rate for Indigenous people was 50.4% compared to 79% for non-Indigenous people. So you can extrapolate from the same table that Indigenous people were with the same level of education at the university level are nearly comparable with 79.4% to 88.4% for non-Indigenous people. What's striking from the statistics is that there is a large differences in labor force activity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It is believed that the government of Canada began, and this is my review of history, it is believed the government of Canada began in earnest to educate Northerners, especially Indigenous people, around 1952. Since 1952, which is 69 years ago, the government of Canada, the government of Northwest Territories has spent billions of taxpayers' money trying to educate Indigenous people. There have been numerous studies conducted on the NWT education system, and one can only wonder why are the Indigenous people of the NWT still having issues with labor force activities and education levels. Economically, unless Indigenous people can maintain the same levels of education as non-Indigenous people, the substantial difference will continue to exist. I brought that up just to make my point in terms of what areas of the economy are most urgent for the government to address. And from my perspective, the government probably has to invest more money at the community level, especially the small communities outside the larger regional centers, to bring the education levels up. And I know there are some current activities that are underway by the Department of Education developing a plan to enhance that. But as I said, I made reference, there's numerous studies. It seems to not have produced the kind of results that would give young Indigenous people the opportunity to get an education that they can then thus become more active in the labor force and subsequently the economy. I just wanted to bring that because that's an issue that's been lingering for some time and never seems to get addressed, but we still spend millions and millions of dollars on the education system. And why I brought this statistic is just to demonstrate that if we as Indigenous people are equally educated as non-Indigenous people, then the government should not be concerned about where those people are, because inevitably they will find ways and means to participate in the economy and contribute to the economy overall. So I guess I was a bit trying, and I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if in fact if I could have some Do we want to have a little bit of dialogue as to what did you really intend to address when you say what areas of the economy are most urgent for the government to address? Or do we want to wait till the members have an opportunity to maybe provide me with a bit more explanation about what are they seeking from this question?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Heron. What we'll do is we'll just, we could finish up your presentation, and at the end, that's how we, everything will come in at the end. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. So the second part is your priorities considering regional economic opportunities and diversification. The pursuit and realization of regional economic opportunities is related to the capacity of the business entities within the region, particularly sectorially, especially at the community level. Assuming the government of Northwest Territories is seeking to have the citizens of the NWT in the workforce and the participation rates are realistic, then some publicly articulated targets for a region should be identified for monitoring and evaluation purposes. Put another way, the government needs to use economic benchmarks to assess whether or not its physical targets and policies are being effective. In communities where economic opportunities are highly dependent on government spending with limited contribution to longer economic sustainability, the boom-bust cycle will most likely be short-lived. Residents will thus likely revert back to some degree of normalcy. For example, building a new school in a small community like Fort Resolution will provide employment for some people, most likely skilled people, for the duration of the construction project. Given the limited number of skilled people in Fort Resolution, one can only assume the demand for skilled labor would be ongoing. Hence, it's unlikely they would be attracted to the construction job unless given the opportunity to negotiate a suitable arrangement between themselves and the general contractor. The size and scope and timing of economic opportunities being pursued is directly correlated with the entity's capacity to capture the opportunities. Strategically, government should realistically establish attainable economic objectives such as reduction of unemployment above the territorial levels for comparable communities, assessment of private sector business is able to secure contracts from an opportunity, measurement of training opportunities and impact on income support activities, just to name a few benchmarks. Any challenges you may be experiencing with government procurement? I think this was, I can say that I've had some difficulty with this question only because I haven't collected a number of, I say, testimonials from existing Indigenous Métis businesses to really explore this subject matter, but I have reviewed the report on procurement report done by the independent panel, and in reviewing the summary, it's quite evident that that just to quote, government procurement is a key economic activity in the territory, representing more than 15% of the GDP. So over the last 5 years, the average annual value of contracts awarded is $550 million. I guess I was particularly interested in the concept that they put forward, and that is, and again, to quote the report, it says, achieving best value means realizing social, economic, environmental benefits where opportunities exist. Value for money in public procurement will remain focused on securing from suppliers the best mix of quality and effectiveness to to deliver contract requirements with the best return on investment. As we heard frequently throughout our engagement, this does not mean requiring contracting authorities to page 4 review of the Procurement Review Panel dated June the 23rd, 21 report of the Procurement Review Panel to select the lowest bid in setting the procurement strategy, drafting contract terms, and evaluating terms. Contracting authorities can and should take a broad view in the value of money that takes social and economic value into account. And I think that's the concept of using the taxpayers' dollars to promote socioeconomic well-being has to be well thought out. And I'm sure you guys know that, and you people, I should say, have reviewed the report and have your own thoughts about it. But I think what's pertinent is that there does need to be a new view of using that fiscal resource to stimulate the economy, and not only stimulate but sustain it in many respects, especially in those areas where the economy is quite dependent on government fiscal policy. And I was particularly interested in the comment that they made in terms of, and this is where it says, and again, quote, in addition, the continued strengthening of Indigenous governments and organizations coupled with the increased commitment to reconciliation and ongoing growth in Indigenous businesses are creating new opportunities for business and partnership initiatives. The panel heard consistent and widespread support for the idea of developing a strategy to support increased participation of Indigenous businesses and governments in GNWT contracting. And one of their recommendations for increasing Indigenous participation in procurement, the panel recommend that government-to-government dialogue are undertaken that to collaboratively develop and implement an approach to advance Indigenous participation in procurement and to identify opportunities to maximize the benefits from procurement for Indigenous people and businesses within the NWT. The real challenge related to experience with GNWT procurement process is the overall inability of small businesses to effectively compete in the public tendering process. The process sometimes is too bureaucratic and complex. The small business efforts to compete becomes a function of their capacity to fulfill its procurement specifications. I think in terms of the recommendation of a government-to-government relationship, I think that's a very pertinent observation and recommendation, recognizing all the events that are now occurring in the Northwest Territories and other parts of Canada, that Indigenous people are seeking ways and means to become more involved in decision-making processes that affect their people as a government, and also to ensure they become self-governing. So your second, or your question, your perspective on the Indigenous procurement policy and how the GNW could improve procurement. As I just indicated, that's a pretty significant aspect of that report. At least there's obviously other things, but what's significant to the nation is the concept of government-to-government relationships. And I would agree that the government-to-government dialogue would be undertaken to work collaboratively in developing and implementing an approach to advance Indigenous participation and to identify opportunities to maximize the benefits from procurement of Indigenous people and businesses within the NWT. First and foremost, the GNW needs to establish clear definition of what body is government representing what body is a government representing Indigenous people? Secondly, who are the Indigenous people of the NWT? While the classic definitions of government might be great for a textbook learning and applied to clarify who might be considered a government, the Indigenous people have always had their own governments to govern their affairs. One can talk about the ongoing impact of colonization of Indigenous people around the world, including our own territory. However, the ongoing evolution of Indigenous people in the NWT, spurred on by principles related to self-determination, case law, adoption of the UNDRIP, and the settling of land claims agreements with Canada and the GMT, will undoubtedly shape future relationships in generations to come. Strategically, the GNWT's efforts to develop procurement policies and implementation activities must involve Indigenous governments. We all know that a one-size-fits-all public policy doesn't work. In order to fulfill the obligations of contemporary treaties with Indigenous people, the GNWT must fully embrace principles related to the autonomy of the Indigenous governments. Indigenous governments need to have real decision-making authority, responsibility, and accountability to their citizens. Co-management of those strategies, strategic investment in Indigenous communities would be one way to advance Indigenous participation and to identify opportunities. They think and some of you are well aware that the devolution and a resource management agreement between Indigenous people and the government of Northwest Territories talks specifically about the government-to-government relationships in the management of land and resources in the Northwest Territories, and that's a very critical agreement that does allow for greater involvement by those people who participated in the devolution agreements to shape what legislation might look like or what the relationship is between the Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories. So there are obviously some existing efforts that are progressing the relationship between Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories that obviously is going to take some further time to develop, but I think we're on the right path. Your experience regarding technical capacity to bid on GNW tenders or contract opportunities, the requests for proposal process and success in obtaining GNW contracts or tenders. Generally speaking, the technical capacity of the business is dependent for the most part on their development as a business and what economic sectors they're involved in. For example, a small construction business may have technical capacity to construct houses, but likely couldn't realistically pursue building a school. The small business entrepreneur would need ongoing outside expertise to assist them in setting up the type of business, financing, bookkeeping expertise, bonding, and set letters of credit, insurance, etc. The larger companies have capacity to pursue larger projects and are capable of meeting all technical requirements of public requests and proposals. So again, I guess I appreciate that. I hope you all appreciate that some of these things are from the perspective of the nation and not necessarily directly related to the business per se, because the nation itself is not in the business per se. The letter to the 27th made also some reference. The committee would, and I quote the letter, says the committee also welcomes any comments your business can provide generally in regards to improving GNW program services to stimulate the development of NWT Indigenous businesses. I'll just take advantage of the fact that this opportunity is afforded to me as a representative of the Northwest Territory Métis Nation. And one of the things the nation has been promoting for the most part is that wherever and whenever the territorial government would listen, is that there has to be a recognition of the distinctiveness of the Métis Nation per se as a government. And to that extent, some programs and services should in fact be, I guess you can say, carved off the public purse, if you want, to enhance the capacity of the Métis to make its own decisions about certain types of activities. And I'll just use as an example, in the area of loans, the Saskatchewan government, the Alberta, the Ontario governments I'm aware of do provide direct capital to Aboriginal capital corporations that in the provinces to lend money specifically to Métis. I think it's something like $4 to $5 million annually by the Saskatchewan government. I think it's about 5 or 6 million or so in the Ontario government. Although that may sound a bit, in some perspectives, may sound like a lot, but given that there's probably 80,000 Métis in Saskatchewan and maybe more in Ontario, that's not an awful lot of capital. But the principle is that, and I know from my own long history of being involved with economic development in the North, that the government of Northwest Territories, as a public government, has continuously shied away from identifying any funds that are specifically targeted at Indigenous people, notwithstanding what obligation they may have in say, education with agreements with Canada. And to that extent, in order to strengthen Indigenous governments and their participation in the economy, there needs to be some ability for the Indigenous governments to act like the territorial government to some degree in supporting and assisting its Indigenous members to pursue economic opportunities, whether they're at home or in their community or elsewhere in the North. And so I know the concept of the territorial government as a public government in many respects may well be competing with the Indigenous governments for clientele. Then let me just use one example. Some of you may know that I've had a long history of being involved with the NWT Métis Dene Development Fund, which is a Aboriginal capital corporation. It's the only one that's owned by Métis and First Nation people in the Northwest Territories. And what it does is it was funded originally by the Government of Canada and continues to be supported by the Government of Canada. And its prime business is to lend money to Indigenous businesses, and particularly First Nation and Métis, but we've also now extended that through policy to Inuit people and non-Indigenous people. In respect to the competition, there's been ongoing competition from the government of Northwest Territories through their ongoing funding of community futures groups. And for the most part, we're both going for the same clientele, but the Métis Dene Development Fund has to support itself through its loans portfolio and other related activities. And I think in that context, in pure economic terms, the ongoing subsidization of community futures by the government of Northwest Territories only makes it that much more difficult for a truly owned Indigenous financial institution. The Métis Dene Development Fund has been operational since 1992. And it's not with pride that I tell people that in those 20, 30 years of existence, just about, there's not a nickel of that money has come from the government Northwest Territories to sustain the Métis Dene Development Fund. In the meantime, we've helped over 300 plus businesses. I think created something like 4,000 or 5,000 jobs in those 20, plus 20, 30 years of experience in the North. So as I say, I would take advantage of this opportunity to, for other types of activities that are going on in the North that I think the government of Northwest Territories has to have a serious look at in terms of what is it doing to be somewhat interventionist in the economy. So, but I think just to reiterate, the 2 points I want to make is that there has to be ways and means for the government to provide ongoing support and assistances to Indigenous Métis on a nation-to-nation basis, and subsequently look at ways and means to strengthen the economy by possibly getting out of some of the businesses that they're currently in supporting and subsidizing Aboriginal community futures that are playing a role, but I don't know whether or not it's an effective role, in the sense that the Métis Dene Development Fund covers the whole of the Northwest Territories and operates with a very lean staff. So those are some of the comments on behalf of the Northwest Territory Métis Nation. I welcome your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Heron. Committee members, do you have any questions for Mr. Heron, Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Heron, for presenting today. I appreciate your comments. I want to maybe ask you a question that's getting a bit into your other role of wearing the hat of chief negotiator, and get some of your input on, how the, ongoing land withdrawals or land claims and settling land claims could fit into this. Our report and our committee's recommendations for improving the territorial economy. And I'm thinking more, not just something as huge as settling the land claims, but any kind of opportunities you see in the realm of early land transfers. Or I know the NWT Métis Nation has been working to get smaller parcels and kind of work in that area. So I'm just, any thoughts you have on how access to land is a limitation right now? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah,
thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Heron?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Johnson, for that comment or that question. And it all relates to the settling of claims. Really, brings a high degree of certainty, but notwithstanding the certainty aspect, it does bring it enhances the government-to-government relationship, so that if you look at some of the agreements that Canada has made with the Métis National Council, I think it's over 10 years, it's in the billions, it's $1 billion plus, and none of that money is coming north. None of it is coming to any Métis organization in the Northwest Territories. And part of that might be that we as a distinct group in the Northwest Territories and Métis per se, we don't think it's necessary for us to be treated as being an adjunct to another national organization. We think as a nation, we want that direct one-on-one relationship as a nation to nation. Now, obviously, we have been asking for land withdrawal. We now have land withdrawal in some of the communities. And to that extent, we also want to pursue housing, for example. And we want to access that government-owned properties that are currently in communities that would help give us the kind of land tenure that CMHC or other government agencies require, in order for us to demonstrate that we are serious, I guess, and they have tenure of properties that they may or may not necessarily have security on. But it's just to demonstrate that those properties would in fact help stimulate the local economy and help reduce the severity of some housing crises that are currently existing in all communities for that matter. So in that context, we can appreciate that early transfer, which would also be a good sign of good faith on behalf of the government of Northwest Territories. It seems ironical that, and I was talking about this the other day, that in a community like Fort Smith, when the government of Canada, the Northwest Territories, the government of Canada established the establishment of a municipal government in a community, and when they had settlements prior to 1967, I think when the town of Fort Smith became a town, there are some former council members who have large tracts of land right in the middle of the town that have not been developed. And this is a classic example why the Métis want to have some direct contributions, if you wish, or grants to it to act autonomously from other public from being treated as the public and the stakeholder, but in fact be treated as government, so we can make our decisions and manage our own affairs without having to be viewed as a public and competing as a member of the public for resources that are being made available by the government of Northwest Territories. So in that context, I guess you can say that because we didn't look at in a community where there's large tracts of land that are owned privately now, there is no easy way of getting those prime properties away from those individuals unless somebody pays for it. But again, it's just those that are first at the trough know that the trough exists, capitalize on the opportunities. And subsequently, one could say that the same thing happens with some of the longer term northern businesses that have been developing, and no disrespect to them, they've been developed over 20, 30 years. They have a dominance in the marketplace, and subsequently the Indigenous groups will either have to buy them out or try to ensure that through, say, negotiated contracts, we'll be able to penetrate the market a little bit and bring employment. And I think the concept of negotiated contracts is a very pertinent vehicle that could be used. And I would agree, I mean, no disrespect to MLAs, but I would agree with the recommendation that there shouldn't have to be a community support type of activity for an Indigenous government to pursue them. And I say disrespect because I think some government interpretation of policy is that unless the MLA agrees, then they can't, they won't necessarily push forward with a contract, with a request to cabinet to approve a negotiated contract. No doubt everybody wants support, but I know one instance where the support of an MLA was denied, and subsequently the bureaucracy said they couldn't move forward with it because the MLA didn't support it. And it really did bring home the point that the MLA, while elected from the public and members of the community are members of the public who have presumably elected them, should not have the power to veto the interests of an Indigenous government. And this is really where the government-to-government relationship could really be fostered and strengthened somewhat if we don't have a process where, in essence, as I said, no disrespect to all you folks that are elected officials, but you shouldn't have a veto over the interests of Indigenous governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heron. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that kind of tension, I think, leads well into my next question, Mr. Heron, which is that I think there's general agreement both in regular MLAs and cabinet to create some sort of Indigenous procurement policy But it's a lot easier said than done, because we run into these tensions of, does that policy mean that, only a government's formal dev corp on their, settled land can have a negotiated contract? Or does it mean just an Indigenous business not attached to a government gets, some advantage? Are we negotiating contracts at the community level? Or should, perhaps the Métis Nation be able to work in a Nuvik? This kind of tension of where to draw the line of when you exclude other Indigenous governments is really, I think, especially because some settled groups have benefit agreements right in their claims. I would welcome your insights on that, knowing that the Métis Nation has kind of this own, development aspect going on, but also represents a number of members who own businesses that operate across the territory, of where that line can and should be drawn. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Herron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think that's the question really is one of being able to respect, and I made it in reference to contemporary treaties and the agreements that are in place, and to that extent, I would not promote the concept that the Métis of the Northwest Territories, with a big corporation themselves, we should go scoop up opportunities in IRC or the Quitchin territory. There has to be ways and means to measure the economic well-being, socioeconomic well-being of the people in the area, and subsequently be able to say that there is a substantial socioeconomic gaps in the well-being of the people there. And that's just used as an example, and it's not intended to be any disrespect or appreciation for what government does. But, some of the people in the South Lake, for example, or our part of the North here, we know that the majority of the wealth or the monies that are coming from royalties are coming from 3 diamond mines. We know that through the resource revenue sharing, the majority of that money, some 63% of the resource revenue sharing that comes from that goes to the Indigenous groups, go to the Inuvialuit, the Quitchin, and the Satu. And we know that of those royalties, that those areas do not produce any wealth that they can say that wealth comes directly from their land. It's coming from another part of the land, and that is for we call it Métis traditional First Nation and Métis land. And to that extent, we're the beneficiaries of that resource revenue sharing is substantially going to those 3 groups. Because the population is small and some groups are not on board with the evolution, people in the Quechua and Det'on were not enjoying the benefits of some of the same benefits, at least some of the resources. So in that context, it was agreed between the parties for that arrangement. But I suspect a day will come when there should be some rearrangements to ensure that those resources, where the resources are being produced and whose land it is, that there will be a greater benefit accruing to the people on whose land it comes from. And to that extent, though, when we talk about nation-to-nation relationship, we have to keep in mind that there has to be an equitable balance in the economy to ensure that if we believe in capitalism and competition, that it produces the best result. Then we want to make sure, and one of the things that are fundamental to Métis interest and historically is that the Métis themselves look upon the state as being a second resource. We want to ensure that the Métis entrepreneur is supported wholeheartedly in order for them to grow and flourish and develop. Only when something is beyond the capacity of a local group that they would resort to having the state look after it. And that's been a long-standing philosophical, if you wish, approach that the Métis have taken. And I know when Norman Wells was being developed in 1982 or 83, there were some local Métis people who wanted to pursue a project that the oil company agreed to give to the Métis Development Corporation. The Development Corporation had policies that said no. And as a result of that, the local Métis entrepreneur was able to succeed and grow and develop and become actually fairly wealthy over it. And there's nothing wrong with that. The state, in this case, the Métis Development Corporation, kept its nose out of the business that should be developed at the community level. So, I think for the most part, the Métis subscribe to that view. They're not much in developing broad state-owned enterprises for the purpose of the enterprise being in the interest of the public. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Heron. Moving on to Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks to Mr. Heron for joining us today. I'm just not quite sure what to make of his point, though, about MLAs having that much say. Certainly, I've never had that much say in a contract. Not that I ever want to either, but maybe that's the way things were done in the past, but I'm not sure that that's the case today. But, I think, and I will say that, too, that the current cabinet is much more inclined to work with us as regular MLAs and hopefully with Indigenous governments, and we're going to push that as much as we can during the last couple of years that we're here. So, but I wanted to ask Mr. Heron about there was that procurement panel, and I'm sure Mr. Heron knows about that. I'm just wondering if how much did they reach out to you folks as the NWT Métis Nation and some of the business interests that you guys have? And I know you talked briefly about the report. You've read it. What sort of overall or any additional comments, suggestions, and where we go with this? Because we all know that GNWT is the biggest source of procurement and contracting in the Northwest Territories, and if we can find ways to keep those benefits here, it's in everybody's interest, and we don't seem to do a very good job at that. So in any event, what was your experience with the procurement review? How do you guys look at getting engaged and involved in that moving forward and making sure that we keep those benefits here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Heron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. O'Reilly. Thanks for the question. I guess let me just appreciate that maybe to the extent that there's not many negotiated contracts in the city per se, that you may have never been requested to provide community support. But if you take some of the constituencies, and I know Mr. Bonner probably was consulted on the highway contract that Dega and Rose Construction now have. It's a fairly substantial contract, but it's in that context, it's the community getting together with a proven northern contractor to pursue work on the highway that employs local people and the local construction company. And in that context, the socioeconomic value of that particular contract is probably worth double what it would be if you're just looking for pure value for taxpayer dollars getting the job done. So it is a reality with some of the negotiated contracts where the MLAs have had a substantial input into the actual granting of a contract per se. Now, in the context of the procurement, I got to say that I personally had some discussions with one of the panel members, but have not really had it wasn't, I guess in my view, it didn't seem to be, and maybe because it's COVID, that the engagement per se was rather marginal in my point of view. And it's not surprising in the sense that, like I say, with COVID, and maybe just the opportunity. It was good to have some numbers, but I think what my references here would be that in order for the Indigenous population to get more out of government procurement, value for money that spreads beyond pure just the product, but the whole socioeconomic impact of procurement, there has to be a collaborative, cooperative relationship between Indigenous governments and the government Northwest Territories. The complexity comes from one of capacity. The Indigenous governments always have to rely on outside expertise to help them with economic studies, or maybe hiring professional accountants or engineers or architects or whatever. And that usually takes resources. And so there's really no cooperation per se that could help maximize the benefit of having the expertise of government. And so when we look at cooperation and cooperativeness, there has to be a development of a true relationship that, the government public servants that's there producing work on behalf of the government should be shared equally with the Indigenous government, so that they don't have to replicate what the government is doing. And if in fact the trust relationship is developed over time, they obviously could go in tandem to pursue common objectives. And the reason I brought the concept of education is that, just again, it demonstrates that probably in the smaller communities, there's not enough money being invested in education, and therefore they're not producing the product that they want. And that's, I guess you can say, that's been kind of a pet peeve, not necessarily a pet peeve, but it's something that over my career, and I don't know if maybe some of you know, but I spent 30 years being more or less a senior bureaucrat. Had I not gone to university and been fairly well educated, I guess I would never have been that successful in the public service. But to the extent that education is the reality in today's contemporary world, we got to be investing money to ensure more and more young people get to be properly educated so they can pursue their own lifelong interests. And I mean, there is a reason why the university kids that are Indigenous have a high employment rate, just like non-Indigenous people, because they're there as basically equals. So I would think that there needs to be a bit more activity between the Indigenous governments and the government of Northwest Territories to formulate a strategy that's going to work for both parties. I don't necessarily disagree with the recommendation that a strategic direction and a unit basically, but my fear is that does that become another bureaucracy with powers that are beyond what is now normal? There are some checks and balances, but does that formulation of a separate unit really do the trick? And my alternative is, if we work collectively, what is needed in the South Slave? I mean, I look at Fort Resolution as a small community. There's limited capacity, but if you're going to put a facility in there, like let's just say you're going to put in a school. Well, could you negotiate that with the community of the First Nation and the Métis together and get a contractor that's going to extend it over, say, 3 years, so that you can adequately train a plumber apprentice and an electrician apprentice, and subsequently at the end of it have at least 3 or 4 tradespeople come out of it? Is there an urgency for that to be built? I mean, the attitude is let's build it as quickly as we can and spend the money now, and we'll provide as much employment as we can. I do know that, and I'm really grateful to the cabinet and I did some work on helping the Fort St. Métis Council get a negotiated contract. And it's with pride that they can say that all the contractors are from Fort Smith, and all the employees live and reside in Fort Smith. And in the case of the Métis, they're constructing a duplex. 95% of those people were Indigenous Métis or First Nation people. But not every community is endowed the way Fort Smith is, because there's tradespeople in a community that can do this type of stuff. But there's no reason it can't go on in Hay River, for example. And so it's just a matter of working with the government of Swiss areas and looking at how it could really get better buck to address the socioeconomic gaps that currently exist in the small communities. I hope that helps, Mr. O'Reilly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. Heron. Next on the list, I have Mr. Norn.
Marcy Cho, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Heron, for the presentation. I was madly scribbling a whole bunch of notes here and stuff, so I didn't have so much a question, but it was more of a comment. And I speak lots with Mr. Bailey. He jumps on the phone with me quite often, and your membership they do express a lot of frustration with with procurement and contracts and business opportunities and employment, and it still happens too, where I've sit in a house, like anytime we have any sort of these opportunities, business opportunities, we need to try to keep as much money as we can in the north and do it fairly. And I know that there's free enterprise and all those things to consider and stuff, but we still see southern businesses and workers come up, and it does draw the ire of a lot of our people, and I think honestly we do have a lot of talent in the north still, to get a lot of this work done. But one thing I noticed, like something in the news that came up in the States there, I think infrastructure is the key. The President Biden, they just passed like a huge bill there, I think 1.2 trillion to inject money into the American economy. It'll create jobs and all that stuff. And I think the way I look at it too, and I mentioned this in the House here last year, infrastructure is going to be key, I think, to restarting, rebooting our economy, because like I said, the mines are not going to always be here. We need to think outside the box and ways to keep money, retain money in the north. That was something that was just on my mind. We got a few developments that we were discussing in the House, i.e., the Tolson, we talked quite a bit about that, and it's right in our backyard, and I think there's lots of opportunity there. I think that was just about it. That's all I wanted to say, and I want to say again, thank you for coming out and sharing with us, and we'll be. I think it's on all of us as elected officials. So anytime we have any observations, if there's, missed opportunities that we should be knocking on the door of the executive and telling, hey, listen, we've got to report it. Keep reporting it. Keep bringing it to the floor. Keep advocating at every juncture. And that's what I do. And that's why I was elected, and I will continue to do that for the next couple of years. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. Mr. Heron, would you like to reply?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Norn. I know that what you exemplify is an appreciation for being in a smaller community and subsequently appreciating those problems that confront the local businesses. And to that extent, I think there has to be some revisions to the ITI's policy on market disruption if they're going to be involved. But we can get rid of market disruption simply by ensuring that Indigenous Métis have a fund of their own to pursue projects if that's what the government in our sisters wants to use the public tendering process. But I know there is still some southern, and there will always be some southern people in the north because there's certain areas of expertise that don't exist. And certainly, I don't necessarily think that government should have to be the catalyst for everything. I mean, there has to be room in it for entrepreneurs, but they have to be given a level playing field. And to that extent, I look at if government can't support more than one business in a small community, then the decision should be made to an Indigenous government to decide for themselves whether they support an entrepreneur to pursue a project or not. And this way, the accountability goes to the Indigenous government as for the public government. So we all agree that we need to make sure that the money stays home and maximizes the return and employment opportunities for the local people. But it has to be done in a way that we're all comfortable that it's planned and we have some definite outcomes at the end of the day. Like I say, with the construction of the school or something, we might end up targeting that there should be at least 4 apprentices that get to be journeyman apprentices in carpentry or plumbing or electrical at the end of the day. But the seasonal ones, I think there's a real challenge with the seasonal businesses as well. You know, in Port Resolution, I know there's 2 or 3 entrepreneurs that have seasonal businesses in the Tulsan. There might be ways and means within India's government to promote winter work, but it should be with encouragement of the entrepreneur, not being dependent on what the government is prepared to invest in. So that's a different approach, and that's why I'm looking with the concept that there should be some, I guess you say, economic development fund going directly to the Indigenous governments in order to stimulate their membership to pursue some of these economic opportunities on their own basis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Heron. Mr. Norton, anything else to add?
No, Mr. Chair, and no, thank you for that. No, I agree totally. And yeah, that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Next on the list, I have Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I was a bit surprised and sorry to hear that GNWT hasn't found a way to support the Métis Dene Development Fund. That came as a bit of a shock to me, but what is it that GNWT can, or I see you getting some free advertising there from MLA Norn, but what is it that GNWT can and should do to support the fund? No support since 1992. Wow, that's not very good. So I'd be interested in hearing Mr. Heron's suggestions or views on that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Heron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Riley. I'm glad that you got my reference to the government of Northwest Territories since 1992. Haven't, and I say this publicly, haven't contributed a nickel to the Métis Dene Development Fund. And that is historically, I think, probably why it is that this is a classic example of public government being unable to cater to the interests of Indigenous people. I think under the guise of public government, you support the community futures at the community level. There's some guises of it being Indigenous, but the community futures are not owned by Indigenous people. They're supported by the government of Northwest Territories. So you may want to have a good hard look at that and say, okay, what are we doing at the community level in lending money? The Métis Dene Development Fund has a strong relationship and delivers some of the CANOR program to Indigenous Aboriginal entrepreneurs. They did a number of years ago under the Northern Economic Development Fund, were able to expand their interest to non-Indigenous people. So they become available. We changed some policies and made it possible for them to loan money to non-Indigenous entrepreneurs. So not necessarily, so they didn't restrict themselves to purely First Nation and Métis. As I said, we extended it to Inuvialuit or Inuit people and non-Indigenous people. So I think it's a private, and I guess one of the ways is to see, instead of the BDIC being the main instrument of government intervention in the economy, it may well be that the Métis Dene Development Fund would be a good source to invest money at, because one of the things that they are doing is which is not maybe the mandate of the IT has changed somewhat, but they do an awful lot of mentoring and aftercare, and that's part and parcel of the business that they offer. Is that they will mentor folks. I know when our existing manager spent some 3 years and off and on in working with the people in Polituk to develop their capacity, and now Polituk has not had to call on MDDF or GL Services, which is owned by MDDF, for ongoing technical assistance. They seem to be doing quite well on their own. I think that's the aspiration of the Métis Dene Development Fund, is that when you reach a certain stage of your maturity as a business, then you could go to the bank and become normal business and secure financing that way. You should not have to depend on a high-risk lending institution, and that's what MDDF is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heron. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Dono. That's helpful, and I appreciate the response from Mr. Heron, and it's probably something we're going to want to look into. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next on the list, I have Mr. Bonatrush.
Merci, Mr. Chair, and merci to Mr. Heron for appearing before us tonight as we review northern business practices in the Northwest Territories. Is always important, as we're all pushing for the northern businesses and for the money to stay in the north as much as possible. And we started making noise when we came here about the BIP policy as it relates to contracts and everything, and we wanted all that reviewed and changed so it benefits the northern businesses. I don't know if you've had a chance to review anything in that regard, and I'm just wondering if you could provide some insight on that. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Bonatrush. Mr. Heron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm kind of smiling to myself when Mr. Bonner was asked if I could give some insight into it, because I was the president of the Housing Corporation at the time BIP was formulated in the North, and it was primarily targeted at of ensuring that there was a process for housing contractors in the smaller communities, the whole of the Northwest Territory, 76 of them, that we wanted to ensure the same aspiration that you have, is to keep the money in the North. And so we looked at devising a system for ensuring that contractors in the housing business were providing maximum benefit to the community. So I think one of the difficulties is that there's no reward penalty regime in the BIP policy. I think it's a good instrument if it did have some mechanisms for enforcement and incentives for doing a good job, or some penalties for not doing a good job. And when we were looking at, and I just as I say just observation in Fort Smith, I know that a local company, we're building a comparable building that we were building, and we noticed there were some Alberta trucks there, and the local rumor was that the company had brought some Alberta folks to do some work on framing and roofing and what have you, whereas we used our own forces in Fort Smith to build it. So I think there is a place for BIP, but you just have to have a good look at it and just see what's the real objective of BIP. What's the objective? And I look at it from the point of view of Is it to stimulate the economy? Is it to reduce the unemployment rate? Is it to increase skilled tradespeople? You know, I just a bit of a sidetrack, but I was talking to a guy from the Delta the other day, and you know, it's hard to get somebody to fix your outboard motors. We used to call them kickers. I don't know if they still call them kickers, but you know, there used to be a time in the communities where a local guy could fix any kicker that you had. Nowadays, it seems like you have to take your kicker from the Delta and send it to Whitehorse where it's being done. And I guess that's the sense of technology, but why aren't we training young people to become better technicians and supporting them at the community level so they can fix their snow machines and kickers and other small outboard motors? And that was their skill set, that they were able to provide that service. So I just use that as an example that we've gone away from encouraging local people to utilize their skill sets in a way that they can provide a service. Part of it is we don't think that it's economical. So what do? We just put it in the truck and spend more money sending it south, as opposed to encouraging entrepreneurship at the community level.
Thank you, Mr. Heron. Mr. Bonachus?
Yeah, Mussy, Mr. Chair, and Mussy for that, Mr. Heron. I was a project officer for the past 11 years with infrastructure, so I'm well versed with what BIP is doing, and then I see what shortcuts people are taking and things that aren't working within BIP. A lot of our contracts, we says that, you know, I've noticed some documents that I've reviewed when I was there that says we should have an evaluation on each contract and discuss the merits of it or the goods and bads of it, but that never happens. Anyways, just move away from that. I'm just wondering, because you mentioned that highway, the washboard highway that's finally getting fixed in Providence, the highway there. And it's a joint venture between Rose and Diga Enterprises, our local Denham Métis Development Corp. But when I go up there, up and down, I just see our guys, well, we got the employment. It seems like that's all we've got. Because most of our guys are, maybe one guy is driving a Packer, you know, one guy on a truck, perhaps. You know, and then nobody's in the class 1 driving big belly dumps and whatnot. Because I did ask them myself, like, what are we getting out of it? But I'm not really getting any answers on that. So it's just like a joint venture that's probably be more meaningful for the company because of the money that's involved rather than capacity building type of thing. That's what I noticed in some of my other joint venture projects that I worked on as a project officer. And that's what I noticed, because once that company's gone, there was no real capacity building except maybe getting a safety certificate. And it seems like to me, the larger partners don't want the small guy that they were in partnership with to succeed. You know, we're always after our development corp. Let's get some equipment. Let's get some of this highway work. You know, there's money there, obviously. But it'll be the day, I suppose. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, just to alleviate a lot of infighting, everybody's fighting for the same dollar, a lot of the same contracts. What are your thoughts on like joint ventures, you know, for sole source negotiated contracts with interested groups within the community, whether it be the Dene and the Métis getting together to form a group, a big contracting group or something. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Mussy.
Thank you, Ms. Bonatruch. Mr. Heron.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Bonner, you know, I guess I go back to capacity. What is the capacity? What's the desire of the community? And you know, we have a tremendous amount of experience in the north, and we're not necessarily sharing it with each other. Sometimes, as Indigenous people, we think that somebody else from outside the town could do a better job than we can, and we kind of overlook our own people. And to the extent that when we talk about joint ventures, I think we need to nourish and encourage our younger people that to go to school and get some of the technical training in order to appreciate the language that's being spoken at the business table. And I just you know, I'm getting to be a fairly mature individual. Let me use that word as a senior. But you know, I had a good start in economic development after I got out of college and went to work in Nunavik with the government of Northwest Territories for a number of years before they decided to sponsor me to go to university. And I thanked them for that. And I put in 30 good years of good, hard, loyal service to the government. They've been repaid more than twice, I guess, for the education they supported me to get. But to that extent, I went to work for the Northwest Territories Métis Development Corporation, a forming first pan-territorial corporation. And we got involved with buying a drilling rig, Cheetah Drilling, out of Norman Wells. But it was with government encouragement that Esso Resources decided to sell us a drilling rig and 3 service rigs to work on the Norman Wells oil field. Now, I didn't do that alone. I did it with the outside expertise and what I had was a group of Métis entrepreneurs who knew business, small business. I had the technical expertise to put it together, and I hired engineers and accountants and what have you to make the deal. But Cheetah Drilling became a fairly successful company over time with Métis and First Nation and ownership, and eventually the Métis sold their interest to the First Nation. The only reason I'm mentioning that is that, you know, when we talk about DEGA and what's in it, is that maybe sometimes you need somebody outside the organization to help you. And you should have the resources to hire somebody outside the organization to share your expertise. I have a friend who's been in, you know, he's about a couple of years younger than me and went to the university. He's a First Nation guy. He's helped companies become multi-million-dollar companies across Canada. And he'd be more than willing as a First Nation person to give you his advice on some financial matters. So it's just a matter of the community companies having some sense of need and resources to hire expertise that they're comfortable with. You know, and to that extent, you know, the people from DEGA should know what do they really want out of a negotiated contract besides jobs. I think most of us are now getting to the point where it's more than jobs. We want to be able to create wealth. You know, when we start talking about Pine Point mining, I think one of the things that we're talking about there is that we want to create wealth. We want to be able to leave Pine Point mine with a substantial amount of wealth being created so that there's going to be sustainability for First Nation and Métis people from the Pine Point mine if it ever happens. So you got to think big. I don't know how much time I got, Mr. Chairman, but I like to think about the day when when the Norman Wells oil field was being expanded, and we were going to build an interprovincial pipeline from Norman Wells to Zama. And I was fairly young, right out of the university, not much out of the university, and I became the CEO for the Métis Development Corporation. We began having discussions with the oil company about actually owning and constructing the pipeline. And that was in 1982. And at the time, I think the pipeline cost $66 million, and we didn't have more than two wooden nickels to rub together. And how can you think about owning a pipeline when you didn't have any money? But now, when the Mackenzie gas pipeline became a topic of discussion of 1.3 or $3 billion, it was just like common. There was no concern about the scope of building a gas pipeline, oil pipeline from the Beaufort to southern Canada. So I think things change. Just that I think we need to be able to feel comfortable that these are big projects, but they're just big projects in numbers. We have the capacity and wherewithal to do it, but we just need some encouragement and some support to make it happen. That's for big projects. So, as I say, I'm a maturing individual, so I've been around a while in some of these areas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Heron. Mr. Heron, this concludes the meeting for the time slot, and I really appreciate you coming and presenting to us. And please pass our regards on to Mr. Bailey, and I hope everything's going well with him. And thank you for taking part today. And committee will take about a 2-minute break to get Mr. Gruner on, and we'll proceed with Mr. Gruner. Thank you, Mr. Heron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can I just express my appreciation to all the members I have an email address, jaheron@the-edge, if you want to call me. And Rylan, I'm a constituent of yours. I haven't met you, but I am a constituent of yours. I live in Yellowknife. So thank you very much, again, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my experiences. Have a good day.
Yeah,
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Heron. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jackie. Bye.
Okay, committee. Now we're going to keep on going. Management LP to introduce himself and proceed with your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Good morning. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Jacobson. So what I'll do is I'll bring up the PowerPoint. Do you guys want me to share it, or do you want to run it from your end?
You could share it or whatever you'd like, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We can run it from here if that works. Thank you.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, so maybe bring that up if you don't mind. I'll maybe start with a quick introduction for myself while we're doing that. So Paul Gruner, President and CEO of Det'on Management LP. I've been in the position for basically 5 years to the day. I started in November 5 years ago. I've spent most of my working career in the north. So actually started in Prince George, where I got both my undergrad and master's from UNBC. Which then took me into Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, and Northern Alberta when I was in the energy sector, then Yukon, Alaska, and now Northwest Territories. So I'm proud to say that I think basically my education and experiences come from the north, and I bring a perspective of various northern geographic locations. I've been in Indigenous business for almost 10 years directly. So before Det'on I looked after a group of Indigenous companies in Yukon and Alaska. So Dakota Capital Investments. And Dakota would have been the largest Indigenous set of businesses in Yukon at the time. I think they probably still are. We had a large construction company, civil, road work. We built a lot of the new housing projects from a civil perspective. Was also president of the largest manufacturing company in Yukon, which was windows and doors manufacturing. And we exported into Alaska and down into southern Canada. That was also Indigenous owned. We had 7 different Indigenous shareholders in that. So had a pretty good run within the Indigenous space. It's something I'm very passionate about. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those experiences with Det'on Show, et cetera. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Yeah, so I've been asked to come to present to you today. It wasn't specifically asked to talk about Det'on Show, but I'll provide a bit of an overview. But what I was asked to speak about a little bit was around the Northwest Territories economy. What are the areas that are most urgent for GNWT to address? The regional priorities for our world within Cheetah East Territory and for YKDFN Det'on Show. GNWT procurement, so some of the challenges, Indigenous procurement specifically, procurement improvements and technical capacity, what our technical capacity is to bid on GNWT tenders. Some of the GNWT programs, so recommendations on improving GNWT programs and services to help stimulate the development of NWT Indigenous businesses. And then lastly, some feedback around the Emerging Stronger plan. Next slide, please. Next one. So I'm going to try and, I've been asked to sort of keep the presentation short, 15, 20 minutes, so we'll hustle through this. Det'on Show Management LP is a for-profit organization like many Indigenous corporations that you'd be familiar with. You know, what I think is great about the Indigenous business space, and Det'on Show is no different. We operate with a social license. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So Det'on Show is an overview. We're about 800 employees if you look at the overall umbrella, 600 of which are local. We put a lot of emphasis around employment and capacity building. So we've actually posted about 1,800 positions over the last 5 years. So we actually track, and I forwarded as one of the attachments our HR dashboard. So we, you know, when I say we have 1,800 positions, we've tracked that year over year. So we're pretty comfortable in saying that. We break those down from entry level, mid, senior, professional. So we know where we're posting within that. We know where our people are, whether it be YKDFN members, other local, Indigenous and non, in those various positions. So I think those are some pretty good numbers. We're one of the largest private employers in the territory. One of the stats that I'm really proud of saying is if you take Det'on Show and Talicho Investment Corporation and combine our numbers together, we are the largest private employer of local people in the territory. And we employ approximately the same number of people as the 3 mines combined, local people. You know, the one piece I will add to that, though, is we wouldn't have those employment numbers, neither would Talicho, if it wasn't for the mining operations in the territory. So both those groups are key suppliers to those mines and to the reclamation projects. We're very engaged in the business community. This is also something that I'm personally very proud of. I would argue that Det'on Show is probably one of, if not the most engaged Indigenous business through various chambers, et cetera, definitely regionally and across the country. So we actually have somebody on the board of the Yellowknife Chamber of Commerce, Northwest Territories Chamber of Commerce, NWT Nunavut Chamber of Mines, Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So we sit on, whether it be regional, whether it be in the mining space, on the Indigenous, and at the national level. And it's great. We have a voice. We're able to bring forward and represent the North, and at the same time build, you know, whether it be through CCAB, advocating for things like, you know, 5% procurement for the federal government. And that's a file that I personally have been invested in for a number of years. And we've also been recognized regionally and nationally. I think it's something that it's not just pride for Det'on Show or Yellowknife Sandy First Nations, but I would like to think that it'd be something that Northwest Territories and the government of Northwest Territories would be proud of having an organization like Det'on Show that's been recognized, whether it be through various chamber awards that we've received over the last number of years. Arctic Indigenous Investment Conference, we've won several times there. Top 10 to watch list for Indigenomics, which is national. The Economic Leadership of the Year through Max Awards 2 years ago. One of the reasons I'm really proud of that is being recognized, seeing the corporation recognized as not just an Indigenous business, but as a key economic driver for the territory. De Beers had won that the year before. And the one that we celebrated about a year ago, which I've got a lot of personal pride in, is Canada's Most Admired Corporate Culture Award. And the reason why I personally have a lot of pride in that, and I can honestly say that is probably the key milestone in my career to this point. We were the first organization to ever win that across the 3 territories, and only one of 3 Indigenous to ever win it across the country. And it goes to show the emphasis, time, energy that we put into building an organization that really embraces development for our employees, celebrating the individual and group wins, and building an organization that people really want to be part of. So that's one that really is, that we're proud of. We just actually re-won it for 2021. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key projects we've had over the last couple of years, highlights. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. I think Det'on Show's done some pretty neat, innovative things over the last 5 years that I've been involved in the team that we've got. First one is the Cheetah Rare Earth Project, which I'm guessing a lot of folks here in the room are aware of that project. What's really very cool about this project is when you look at the supply chain for rare earths, approximately 90% come from China. And whether you be a fan of or supporter of China or not, the reality is when you've got 90% of your supply chain coming from one source or one geography, that can be very challenging and creates a lot of risk. So those rare earths are what's required in technology, your cell phones, the computer screens that you're looking at right now, green energy, etc., renewable energy. So it is a really important piece to the modern world. This represents the first rare earth project in Canada to date. As we know it, through our Det'on Show Nahanni, we're the contract miners on that site. We're the first, as we know, Indigenous miners in our traditional land, which I think is pretty amazing. It's about an 80% Indigenous workforce on that project. I've been out on site multiple times, so I just had a few pictures there. I was out a few weeks ago. For those that haven't been out on site, if you get the chance, please take it. So that top picture is actually one of our crews that are working, again, predominantly Indigenous. I think it's really neat if you look at the bottom right, where signage on site is in the traditional Welliday language, so really embracing sort of that cultural piece for the mine site itself. The project itself is what they call a dry process. So really it's a drill blast like any other mining project, taking your rock to source. There's a sorter, you crush that down to a specific size. You run it through your sorter, which is the same technology they use at diamond mines. So it actually focuses on separating the waste rock from the rare earths, which is what you want to keep. It uses a technology where it simply blows using air the rare earths that get separated out, and then they bag that up. And just the last couple of weeks, that was shipped out of the territory and will go for processing in Saskatchewan. So it's a clean, dry process. No chemicals are used. Very benign. Next slide, please. This is another neat one. So I think we just announced this one a couple of weeks ago. So it's a larger piece. We acquired Slave Lake Inn to move the Vitel Able boarding home into. But if you go back about a year or so, when we secured funding for our housing initiative for YKDFN, it was about $18 million of funding. Part of that was to retrofit the Vitel Able boarding home that's located in Bilo. So it allowed us to repurpose that building and we were able to gain access to funding not only for the housing initiative, but we worked with Canor, which I think they'll probably be announcing publicly here shortly, that we could secure the new location. We'll be putting in a commercial kitchen into that. And it's a brand new facility. I think it's only a couple years old, so much better fit for purpose. So the old Vital Able boarding home not only needed some repairs and upgrades, it is a 30-plus-year-old facility, but it also is not really set up in a COVID world. So right now, I think it's 6 rooms to every bathroom. That obviously, from a health and safety standpoint, has got some challenges. So it really was a great fit where, we were able to retrofit an old facility, we were able to create much required housing, and ultimately get into a better product in partnership with GNWT. So it's a great project that shows through working with multiple stakeholders, being YKDFN, the Corp, federal government, and territorial government, you can get some real wins and create value for all parties. Next slide, please. Det'on Logistics. This is another really great example, I think, of Indigenous business being creative and creating real value. So this is a model that I personally really like. This sort of comes from something called the private equity space, where you've got a management team that has an equity position in the business. So they're incentivized to grow the business, to create something called enterprise value, and to manage risk. So in this case, we own 51% of Det'on Logistics. So it is a majority-owned Indigenous company. The 49% owned by the management team. It was what they call a greenfield project. So we didn't acquire a business. We simply went in, pooled capital, and started off, I believe, with the De Beers contract, now over 10 years ago, through a series of acquisitions and organic growth. So, we started off with our, initial facility, a smaller facility by the airport. I think about 3-4 years ago, we announced the acquisition of G&G. So that we moved into that site. That included the Diavik contract and a few other smaller contracts. And then recently, we announced a strategic partnership with BBE. We acquired that facility. We sold the G&G building. And now we provide all of the logistics support for the mines, for the reclamation projects, the airport, and we're now into Nunavut and Alberta. So that makes us, from a pure logistics standpoint, the largest Indigenous-owned logistics company in the country. And it's something called 3PL and 4PL. So we're excluding those Indigenous groups that own airlines. We're a pure logistics company. So a great example of creating good value over that 10+ years, managing risk, and again, making what we call business case decisions. And every time we do an investment or a partnership, et cetera, we are analyzing that, we're managing the risk, and we're making sure that we're putting our capital to good use. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about, again, in my personal perspective of what NWT economy, what's most urgent to address. Next slide, please. So I think, really broken that down into 3 sort of subsections. First one being the mineral sector. So if you look at the history of NWT, the resource sector has played a substantial piece in terms of building that economy. We've seen over the years the energy sector, which has been in decline over the last number of years, but played a major part in driving the economy. We had a gold sector for a number of years. We're seeing some of those projects, like the one close to town being developed. So we're seeing new projects that are under development. But the one that plays obviously a major part in our road right now is the diamond mines. So those diamond mines, the production from there makes up about 30% of NWT's GDP. It actually is makes Canada the 3rd largest producer of diamonds in the world, of natural diamonds. It's a major employer. So when we look at, how many people does that employ, we have to look not just at something we call primary drivers being directly employed by the mine, but also by companies like Det'on, which is secondary. And then in terms of like hospitality sectors, et cetera, is what they call tertiary. So it's a major driver of employment across those three sort of subsections. Higher earnings. So I think that's something that really needs to be kept in mind. And the reason for that, that mining sector does drive those higher wages. So just to give an example, if you look at Bowie Camp Catering Services, which we provide all the camp catering services for 3 of those sites, not Acadie, but both of De Beers sites and Diavik. Somebody cleaning rooms with all-in wages, subsidies, camp allowances, etc., would be making sort of 65, 70,000 plus a year. Those same skill sets would be half that if they were employed in one of the hotels in town. So same skill sets, but with that, those higher earnings come from it, and the quality of life. And being mindful that, a study done a couple of years ago, a working wage in Yellowknife, I believe, was at $24 an hour. There's no seasonality involved with that. So the reason why I highlight that, there's lots of talk around the reclamation mediation economy. It's one that we want to play a major part in, but something to be mindful of around the reclamation economy is their seasonality. So if you're working, whether it be in the support services or directly for any of those mines, you've got steady employment year round. And yes, it's going to be shift work a lot of the times, but if you look at reclamation, you're going in, you're reclaiming during the summer and fall seasons, and then you're shutting that down in the winter because it becomes cost prohibitive. So Snap Lake is the one that's going to be going forward right now, probably starting next year. We haven't heard any reason why it wouldn't be. Is a perfect example where that project will probably go for about 3 years and will operate for about 7-8 months of the year, year over year for 3 years. Lastly, touched on it, the reclamation economy. It is an emerging piece, and it's that last part of the mineral sector, and I think often sort of forgot about. A real key piece is something that Det'on Show specifically sees being a major part in, whether it be the diamond mines, giant mine, etc. Next one is the tourism sector. So obviously, we've seen some major challenges here during the pandemic. It was a significantly growing economy here in the territory. We've seen that scale back. We have some challenges right now, I think, because of that. So Yukon has strategically really positioned themselves to take advantage of NWT's restrictions on borders. So in September, Yukon had the best month it's ever had for its hotels, largely driven because of the Aurora viewing, and they're attracting that. It is a major employer. I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I know that the tourism sector has year over year increased its employment numbers up until the last year and a half. From a seasonal perspective, obviously there's some seasonality associated with it. It's largely our tourism is being winter, sort of that fall winter. And again, there are lower wages on that. I think it's something to be mindful of. It's not going to replace the mineral sector. Lastly is infrastructure. So it is a major economic stimulator. If you look at countries around the world, when you've got challenging economic landscapes like NWT does, and will increasingly have so going forward, infrastructure is that key driver where you can get people working and building that economy. I would highly recommend that for the infrastructure projects, look at what we call revenue generating projects. So those are the projects that not only are stimulating the economy during its construction, but has a revenue generating component, as in it will build an economy once those projects are in place. So the two that are sort of top of mind would be things like Slave Geologic Corridor and the Tolston Power Project and expansion. It can lead to a lower carbon footprint. So we've seen lots of talks, and increasingly so and good, around reducing the carbon footprint, not just within NWT nationally, but globally. So if we're going to build economies going forward, we must reduce that carbon footprint. And as a result of that, lower the cost of living. NWT is very expensive. Power is expensive. Goods, services, etc. So wherever we can to reduce that cost of living and increase the overall quality of life for NWT residents. And then lastly, the concept of environment, social governance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here, but ESG, for anybody that's not familiar with that, is increasingly becoming a key driver from an investment perspective, whether it be in the resource sector, even looking at Government of Canada when they're looking at initiatives taking place in jurisdictions across the country. So things like Tolston, where you're replacing diesel cogen units with hydroelectric or alternative energy projects. All part of that is the ESG driver that's coming out of that. If you're not familiar with ESG, please reach out to me one-on-one. I do a lot of work and research in this. It is going to be a key driver for many industries. Next slide, please. Oh, can I get the next slide? Perfect. So this is a slide I've taken out of the 2018 Socioeconomic Agreement Report, or the Diamond Mine Report. So it really looks at, I think, about 19, 20 years of procurement that's taken place from the diamond mines. It is an incredible number at $14.5 billion that's been spent. 70% staying local, 31% approximately going directly to Indigenous. So, when we think about the circular economy, those diamond mines have been a key driver in building some of those businesses and being that large employment driver. What I really like about what's taken place, and we've had lots of discussions, whether it be Yukon when I was there and now NWT around something, Indigenous procurement. There can be sometimes pushback around this, and this is a great example to show that both Indigenous and non benefit from things like, the impact benefit agreements, right? It creates those sticky dollars and allows businesses, whether it be Indigenous and non, to really prosper. And again, it really shows that the Indigenous supply chain is a major contributor to the local economy. We're not just employers of our people, of our YKDFN members. We employ across a vast number of Indigenous groups and northern residents. Next slide, please. This is just a really quick snapshot, again, because I really do believe that the mineral sector is a key driver of our economy today and definitely going forward. It just shows the various pieces of the mineral sector where there's opportunities. So if you cast your mind back to, over the last 10 plus years where we were in the construction phase for some of those mines, huge amounts of money that are being spent during that period of time, the procurement of materials, the services that go in, the labor in constructing those. We're now very much into the ongoing service side or ongoing operations. What's nice about that period of the mining cycle is it's year-over-year revenue. So the groups that are involved in that secure those longer-term contracts, they can really plan for that. We can create some really nice, meaningful employment and capacity building. And as we've seen now with Snap Lake, that's currently in care and maintenance, we're now moving into some of that reclamation. The point of this slide really is that all through the mining cycle, the mineral cycle, is there's a large number of opportunities, and we're seeing Indigenous increasingly becoming more sophisticated and being able to provide service and value through that life cycle. Next slide, please. So we talk a little bit more about the environment, social governance, or ESG. Very simply put, environment is sort of how companies conduct themselves, stewards of the land and nature. This aligns very nicely with a lot of Indigenous in terms of their perspectives, certainly Yellow Knife First Nations. Social is how it manages its employees, suppliers, the communities that it operates in. And then governance is sort of that leadership, how it's managed, the internal controls, et cetera. If you cast back 20, 30 years ago, we had something called corporate social responsibility. That was very much sort of, not flavor of the day, but a key driver within the business space. ESG is not an extension of that. It is something new. And what it really comes down to, simply put, is its risk mitigation. So when we look at BlackRock, which is a very large private equity firm, dumping in billions of dollars into ESG, if we look at large multinational mining companies that are saying they're going to get to net zero in terms of carbon emissions, et cetera, all of that is ESG, and all of that is driven through risk and risk mitigation. And where we've got a great opportunity, whether it be Northwest Territories, North Canada in general, is that we are very well positioned to be the ESG best in class when it comes to the resource sector, and in NWT predominantly driven through the mineral sector. So if we can be the ethical mineral extractors around the world, that will drive a lot of that investment dollars or opportunities into the territory. But from that, we need to continue to develop in the Indigenous space, and we need to bring in projects like Tolston that are going to reduce our carbon emissions substantially. It's going to be very challenging to bring on new mining projects or new resource projects that are driven by something like diesel cogen units. That's becoming increasingly less favorable. Next slide, please. Next one. So when we look at, what are the regional opportunities, what are we focused on as a corporation, as a nation? Reclamation remediation is obviously top of mind. It's something that we're already having a meaningful part of. We're one of the major suppliers on Giant Mine. We oversee currently the care and maintenance on Snap Lake. We expect we'll be part of the key players in terms of the reclamation of Snap Lake. So reclamation remediation is something we're putting a lot of time and energy into. I think there's a study that's underway right now, driven by the territorial government, but we really need to understand what does the reclamation remediation economy look like, and having real conversations about that. In terms of seasonality, in terms of the employment that can be generated from it, and in terms of what the real value is. Simply saying that the reclamation economy is going to save NWT without that analysis, we need to put that time and energy into it first. Net new resource projects. So Cheetah is the one that we're involved in right now. Gold Terra, again, very close and within our traditional territory, is another one that we're starting to put a lot of time and energy into. We're very interested in that key infrastructure projects. So again, Slave Geological Corridor and Tolston. We're part of working groups on both those projects. We're looking to be meaningful in terms of being part of that supply chain in terms of their development. Housing. So YKDFN Housing Initiative, we'll be working on that over the next couple of years. We want to make sure we get that right. It's not only value for our community, but if that's something that we can become experts in having trained labor and execution, that makes us well positioned for other housing initiatives in Yellowknife and across the territory. We're also exploring initiatives around temporary housing to support projects going forward. So one of the things that we see as a key risk or a challenge, particularly over the next 5 years, could be longer, is if we look at some of these new projects that are coming on stream, like Snap Lake, Giant Mine, key infrastructure projects in Yellowknife, like Avens, et cetera, all of those projects are going to require labor, and we don't have the housing to support that labor supply. We won't be able to provide all of that labor from locally. It's going to have to come from outside. And one of the things that we've talked about is how do we have some temporary housing so that we may not be getting that labor supply from, say, quote unquote, Yellowknife area. How can we bring that from across the territory? So whether that be from a Nunavik region, Satu, et cetera, again, that comes down to part of that circular economy. If we can keep our labor force from a territorial perspective, we all win from that. But we have to be creative in finding some of those housing solutions. And then lastly, YK commercial. So we certainly brought that up to several of our MLAs. We'd absolutely be interested in exploring some of that commercial real estate downtown. It's going to take some creative work around long-term leases, but what an opportunity to have multiple Indigenous groups come in, take some of that commercial or all that commercial real estate from southern REITs, make it local, and keep that value again at a local level. Quickly though, that's a picture of our senior leadership team. So I always like to throw in a few pictures in my presentation to give it a little bit more of a local look and feel. One of the things that not only do we do a lot of work around employment, we do a lot of work on capacity building. And so we will work with within our head office to build capacity files so that we're developing our next leadership for YKDFN members to take on those senior leadership roles. Something that we put a lot of time into in the last couple of years, and we're seeing a lot of success from that. Next slide, please. Next slide. So a little bit about NWT procurement. So a bit of the backstory, when I was in Yukon, I was instrumental in bringing forward an Indigenous procurement policy and strategy for Yukon government. So we've seen that got executed in the last year, which is great. That was in the works for about 6-7 years, starting obviously with some advocacy work and then getting into building that within the platform, and then subsequently, a working group that saw that through. So I've got a little bit of background around the procurement piece and certainly on the Indigenous side. Some of the challenges that I've seen in NWT are the same challenges we had in Yukon and I'm sure other jurisdictions, but lots of good opportunity. So what are the challenges for NWT? It can be difficult to navigate and often not representative Indigenous. So again, going back to Yukon bringing out a Indigenous procurement strategy. Federal government has one. They've mandated 5% of all federal spend, which is representative of Indigenous populations across Canada. Even, let's say, something like the City of Toronto has something called a social procurement, which is not specific to Indigenous, but certainly includes Indigenous. You're seeing a lot more of that representation of Indigenous across various procurement pieces across the country. What's our thoughts around Indigenous procurement? We're in support of it. I think it assists Indigenous groups to have participation in the local economy. If that means that we can grow that economy together and have more Indigenous in some of those smaller remote communities, that's going to bump up your employment numbers. It's going to keep those dollars local. And most importantly, builds that capacity at a local level where they can sort of execute business going forward. You probably saw an article that came out a year and a half ago now called Sticky Dollars. We did that through Aboriginal Business Quarterly, largely driven through myself, Mark Breyer, who's the president CEO of Jwt Investment Corporation, and Daryl Bolio with Denonday. If you haven't seen it, reach out to me. I'd be happy to send you a copy. In procurement improvements, where can we see some of those improvements for the existing procurement we have today? Again, going back to that concept of circular economy, I think there needs to be more time and energy put into tracking. So we seem to have had some slippage over the last 5-6 years or so in terms of that local inclusion piece. We're seeing more of those southern contractors coming in to execute. I'll give you a great example of where we had our challenges in Yukon. When I was president, CEO of Castle Rock Enterprises, which is a large civil contractor, we were doing the hospital and doing all the site prep. And the problem that we had with that project was the general came from outside the territory. Their mandate is obviously to maximize value for their shareholders, as is ours. And ultimately, the subcontractors that were local, and everybody celebrated about how great it was that all these subcontractors were local. The problem was that they were really grinding in terms of those margins, and a lot of those subcontractors, including our own, basically broke even on that project. So there wasn't a great deal of value that was left at a local level. So really having those tracking mechanisms and understanding what is the local value piece that's being created, whether that be from a GDP perspective, number of companies that are local, how many local people that are employed within that, and often, and even more importantly, how much capacity is being built so that we're seeing value created beyond just the project itself, but we can replicate that going forward. The last question that was sort of asked to me around, what is our ability to bid on some of those larger contracts? We work with a lot of our partners. We have limited internal capacity, when it comes to those larger scale procurement projects. The reality of it is, it's very challenging to find the expertise, and so for us, we have to build enough scale and opportunity with GNWT procurement to warrant the cost of building in that capacity. And that for us, if we had more opportunities to engage, whether it be through direct negotiation on contracts, like say Geologic Corridor, or an Indigenous procurement strategy that we could build a business case or a business plan to, we could build more of that capacity. Right now, it would be at-risk capital, and we simply can't afford to do that without having an end game. And if Det'on is challenged or struggling with that, I'm guessing that when you start looking at some of the smaller, with lower capacity groups across the territory, they're really going to have their challenges with that. This picture came from Giant Mine, Feed the Fire ceremony. So I think that was probably about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. We've been putting a lot of time and energy for advocacy with the federal government. We made an announcement, I think a month or two ago, around a socioeconomic agreement. Again, doing our part to not only keep that value for YKDFN, but at a local level for other impacted Indigenous groups. Giant Mine is something that, including GNWT, should very much be involved in because of the value created, the employment, and again, going back to that reclamation economy piece, we all play a part in making sure that value stays local. Next slide, please. There we go. So we were also asked around just Jwt Program Recommendations, so in general. So we've taken advantage of a number of territorial programs, particularly around job creation capacity building. So we do a lot of work with both the territorial and federal programs and combining those two together, which is great. It allows us to reduce our cost and to have a more meaningful impact with the dollars that are being spent. So we've had some experiences for sure. So I think, the first recommendation would be to, again, going back to those tangible results, make sure it's quantifiable and measurable. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that the dollars are being spent, that you can measure the return on investment, right? And hopefully what you're getting is if you're spending $1, you're not getting $1 back, you want to get those multiples, right? So you spend $1 and you get, $3 or $4 or $5 worth of value back. And that can be measured in a number of different ways. But I think really focusing and ensuring that the dollars that are being allocated, that you're getting those tangible results, right? Creating the value that you're going to see year over year going forward. Focus on that capacity building. So again, Det'on, I think over the years, in 30 plus years of being in business, we've built some capacity. We've created a corporation that is one of the largest private local employers. Well, let's go build more Det'on across the territory. Let's build that real capacity so that groups, not just the Det'on to Lichos or up into Inuvik, where we can have groups that are hiring within their communities and moving beyond that contract piece where they can build business opportunities, employment opportunities year over year. And when we look at things like the Indigenous procurement strategy, I would argue that actually has to be a three-pronged approach. So Indigenous procurement is just one piece of that. That creates the opportunity. The second piece would be around layering in government programs, from GNWT, from the federal government. But GNWT can certainly assist in working with those federal programs and with various communities where you can now reduce the cost of labor and capacity building. And then lastly, is that major, the ability to execute work. You want to be able to build the capacity where folks understand and have the tools to execute the business year over year. And something that we've proposed is something called the Indigenous Business Center of Excellence. Just a name that we threw at it. The concept being is that it's something that can be housed or in partnership with Aurora College. And that looks at best practices that are taking place, whether it be the Det'on of the world or other Indigenous groups across the country, so that we can help assist some of those groups with lower capacity on building on those successes. And it's also an opportunity to highlight the Indigenous business capacity we have in NWT and pan-territorially. I've given a number of presentations over the last year or so, whether it be through CCAB, over in South Africa, Mongolia. People are amazed by the amount of Indigenous business that takes place in the supply chain, in our case, in the mining space. We really do have something that can be highlighted. So I think that can be a real draw, and not just nationally, but globally. So the Indigenous Business Center of Excellence is that third pillar that assists those groups in building the capacity to execute. Next slide, please. So the last sort of slide was, commenting on the Emerging Stronger plan. So we do a lot of work when we build our strategic plans, for Det'on for the various businesses. They're succinct, they're measurable, they're quantifiable. The Emerging Stronger plan, quite frankly, was very generic. So it was very broad statements with little tangibles. Agree in principle, but it was more of a plan to plan, right? So the fact that took, a year to generate, would have expected, and we've heard that from the general business community, would have expected more tangible outcomes from that we can measure to, expecting that at some point there'll be an execution strategy that comes out of it. And that really comes down to project management. You can have your broad statements, and in theory they sound great, but if you're not executing on it, it's valueless. We need to see some key performance indicators. So how do you quantify success? What is success? And what are you measuring to? We know that over the next 10 years, as those diamond mines start to wind down and reclamation is not going to have the same employment drivers, we know what's ahead of us. So number one is determining what's going to be the amount of displaced labor that's going to come from that, and how are we going to deal with that? And that's what we would expect from the Emerging Stronger plan, something that's quantifiable and has real outcomes and results. And then lastly is a review strategy. It needs to have an annual review with, again, those KPIs that you're measuring to. What is your success indicators? So on an annual basis, probably would layer in some sort of an oversight group. And if you're not meeting those targets or those metrics that you're looking for, what are you going to do to correct and get back on track and create the value that plan is trying to achieve? Next slide, please. So that's the last of my sort of formal presentation. Like I said, I was asked to keep it as short as possible and then sort of open it up to overall questions and general discussion. So I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you. Thank you for the time. Masi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gruner, for your presentation. It was a lot of information. It was, and really, I enjoyed it. First of all, before we start, I'll get the members to introduce themselves before we get into questions for Mr. Gruner. Members?
Hi, Ron Bonitrush, the MLA for Det'on. Masi.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Alan Johnson, MLA for Illinois North.
Caitlin Cleveland, Cam Lake.
Steve Norn, Tunawilla.
Thank you, members. First on the list, I have Mr. Bonitrush.
Well, I thought we would let Mr. Norn go first since he's got an appointment coming up, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I just seen the message board. Thank you, Mr. Bonitrush. Mr. Norn.
Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I do have to duck out here soon, but I just want to say thank you to Mr. Gruner. I applaud all the hard work that you do. And all the people. I wish people would see all the little things that you do behind the scenes to, help help families, support families through creating meaningful work and business opportunities. And I just wanted to thank you on that, and thank you for the presentation. Very informative. I did have one quick question here. So, in terms of best practices around the world, and in terms of what other countries or what other areas have you seen that we could probably follow the lead on in terms of engaging with Indigenous business. I know that in Alaska they have that 5A program, I believe it is, that that was some fascinating stuff that I read up on. But I was just wondering if there's any place else in the world or any other areas that you can flag for us.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So, I mean, one of the areas.
Thank you, Mr. Nord, Mr. Gruner.
Yeah, sorry, guys. So, you're right. One of the areas that I've taken a lot of my personal learnings from was my experiences in Alaska. What I like about what I've seen in Alaska is they were set up to succeed from the 70s. I'll give you an example of what really inspired me. We were looking at expanding our operations in Alaska. Oh boy, 8-9 years ago, they were having oil was down. Obviously, they do a lot of Alaska is known for its North Slope, Arctic Slope for oil production. So we were a bit concerned about what the state of the Alaska economy would look like for our businesses over there. And so we did a tour. We met with the various Indigenous groups, government officials, etc. And one of the totally gapping now in terms of who it was from the state that we met with. But we raised the question around, how much the economy, the local Alaskan economy, was in sort of tied to the oil sector. They said we're a lot less worried about that than we ever have been. And so, well, why is that? I said, well, the Aboriginal, and they go by the term Aboriginal in Alaska. The Aboriginal corporations are of now such a size, stability, and economic driver in the state that they now drive a lot of that economy. And so we're not as tied to the resource sector as we once were, right? And I thought, what an amazing, empowering statement to hear back, right? Now, no different when we go back and looking at Det'on and Talicho. Again, that's something that I'm personally proud of. I'd like to think that you guys are all proud of that you have your largest private employer local people are 2 Indigenous groups. Think about that, what that means. That is incredible. So if you scale that to an economy the size of Alaska, if we continue to grow the maturity of our Indigenous groups, like the Det'on, the Talichos, et cetera, we can be making those same statements. When we look at the 10 largest private businesses in Alaska, 9 of them are Aboriginal. 3 of those did over $1 billion last year. So the group I know best is Nana Corporation. Nana does about 1.6 billion US. They own 35% of Red Dog Mine, which is one of the largest zinc mines in the world. Their senior management is representative of their communities. And if you go down into Anchorage and drive downtown Anchorage, you've never made it to Alaska, do it. It's obviously a beautiful spot. But if you drive downtown Anchorage and look at those high-rises, you see all of those Aboriginal corporations' names on those high-rises. So Ryland, I know that you're very passionate about commercial and seeing that staying local. That's what Alaska's done. And they've done that through working and like I said, being set up in the 1970s to succeed. They've had their challenges. So when we went and meet with those senior folks, they have the same challenges we do at $50 to $100 million a year, at $1 to $2 or $3 billion a year. They've had their financial distresses. Several of them talked about going bankrupt. But over the years, they've learned from that, and they've built something that's sustainable. They've built something that the state relies on. And if we look at and scale that to what we have in NWT, NWT to Canada is what Alaska is to the lower 48. So, I mean, Steve, there's other opportunities or places you can look to. But I would say that Alaska, particularly because it is north, because from a scale perspective, if you look at it, Canada versus the US, that's what I'd be looking at in terms of what success can look like. I think we're going down that path. But the one thing I would definitely encourage everybody here in this room today is the resource sector has to play a part in that. And we have to invest in our Indigenous groups and our corporations to ensure that we have that capacity, not just the Det'on and Talichos, but at those community level where they can go and conduct business. We are still, and I'll speak very freely here, probably a generation or 2 generations away in some of those communities in terms of really adopting some of those sort of free enterprise and those economic type principles. Again, Alaska has been at it since the 70s. And when you talk to both the Aboriginal groups and with government, they'll talk about how they worked collectively to really set that up from the 70s. We're looking at land claims, they own the land, how they manage it, partnering on development of key infrastructure, partnering on building the capacity within the resource sector, supply chain, et cetera. They've really done it and lived and walked the talk. Does that sort of fit your bill, Steve?
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. Norn.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, yes, Paul, that really did kind of, yes, open up my eyes a little bit, because, yeah, this is just a really important piece, and we still, like you said, you're right, we still are, we do have our challenges in terms of, like with land claims and stuff like that or whatnot, moving forward. So, but yeah, I guess what I'll do, I do have to run out. My apologies here. So maybe perhaps like we can have some offline conversations, Paul, and yeah, thank you for your time again. And I'm just going to sign up here. Merci, Joe.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Norn. Next on the list, Mr. Bonnetush.
Merci, Mr. Chair, and merci to Mr. Gruner for presenting to us this morning regarding all the questions that committee is looking for regarding Northern business and the engagement process. And he's brought lots of great insight. I know he's got probably he's got lots of experience and the qualifications, to handle all this and to bring it to fruition. And of course, the magazine that was there from the winter of 2019, The Rise of Det'on Show, well, that says it all there. It's very impressive as Aboriginal people, as a Dene, we feel proud for Det'on Show. So I have lots of friends up in the Yellowknife Dene, and also the Clecho Investment Corporation too. Nice to see the two large corporations in our area succeeding and still breaking trail. I noticed that you have a management team. I just wanted to get more insight in that there, because it sounds like a good fit to have probably an oversight committee like your management team to help with the vision of the Det'on Show and the various partnerships that have been built. And I'm wondering what's the makeup of that management team, and where are they based? If I could just start with that. Mussy.
Thanks, Mr. Bonnerouge. So I'm assuming when you say management team, you're talking about the Det'on Show management team, correct? Yeah, okay. So the management team is all based here. We are local. We are Yellowknife NWT residents. That's something I'm very proud of. So we are invested in our community in terms of living, breathing, shopping, etc. The management team is sort of made up of a mix between both YKDFN and non-YKDFN members. So when I first got to Det'on Show 5 years ago, we've got approximately 20 or so in the head office. We had one YKDFN member. We have approximately 50% now in the head office. So we make a very strong effort in terms of hiring our members within the management team, within the head office, and then obviously percolating that down into our various companies and partnerships. We're now running up against a bit of a interesting issue. So if you look at from a hiring standpoint, we're competing against the GNWTs, the feds, the mining sector, et cetera. A lot of the time, those groups can pay better, have better benefits. So it can be a bit challenging for us to navigate that, which is why I go back to winning that Canada's Most Admired Corporate Culture Award, building an organization where people aren't going to simply say, hey, listen, I can go make another 10, 15 grand a year more at GNWT. I like the fit. I like the feel of Det'on Show and sort of the growth that I have there, right? So it very much is a local look and feel. That management team is local. It is a mix of YKDFN and non-members. And I can tell you that we put a significant amount of time and energy into that capacity building. So every person that you saw in those pictures has their own sort of development plan. They've got a budget where it's both formal and informal learning. And we bring our members into various strategic meetings, et cetera. Our board meetings get a little bit full, shall we say, because not only, again, living and walking the talk, we bring in a lot of the folks that we're developing into our board meetings. And so it's not just, say, myself or the CFO presenting to the board. We'll literally have, 8 to 10 people, often from the management team, so that everybody has sort of the opportunity to present within their files. And also, again, building that capacity where they start having governance experience, leadership experience, that presentation experience, et cetera. So it may not always be the cleanest, and it may not always be, shall we say, flawless, but it's a journey, and it's one that we continue to grow, develop, and build on.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. Bonatrush?
Mussy, Mr. Chair, and mussy for that, Mr. Gruner. Appreciate the insight into that. Wish many other development corps that were developed from years ago in the 80s and stuff would have had open minds. Let me just say that. Anyways, I'm just kind of curious about something you're talking about, the Alaska North Slope, and you guys are looking at mining, getting into the mining projects and stuff like this. And I know my area and different areas, every time you talk about mining or oil and gas and everything, everybody is up in arms because of the environmental disasters or contaminants that can happen on these lands. And it's interesting to note that Det'on is First Nations company. I'm just wondering if anybody has any environmental concerns getting into this questionable area. I just don't know what must see.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonatrush. Mr. Gruner.
Sorry, I'm not good at the protocol, folks. I apologize. You're a little more formal than we are. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a great question. So I'm going to give you, Mr. Bonatrush, if you're okay with it, I'll give you sort of how we work with YKDF and our leadership on that. And then if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to give you Paul Gruner's personal view. No judging. So, we don't unilaterally go and work with proponents, projects, et cetera, right? So one of the things that we put a lot of time and energy into between Det'on and the First Nations, which I think is a little bit different. And, I take that from my experiences. I've sat on multiple DevCorp boards. I've run multiple Indigenous corporations. So I've got a little bit of a view beyond YKDFN, shall we say. And one of the challenges that can exist, believe it or not, I guess, the corporation and the First Nation or the Indigenous group don't often or always have the best communication between the two, which is a bit mind-blowing because they represent the same shareholder or same community. So one of the things that we put a lot of time and energy into is, myself and my counterpart, in this case, Lena Black, was Jason Snaggs up until a few months ago. We were talking on a weekly basis. We have a weekly call with the chiefs, and we've got various communication mechanisms back to the leadership. So whether it be the Cheetah project or Gold Terra or whatever that may be, we're not going to go out and unilaterally start supporting or working with it until we have a good understanding from leadership that people are comfortable with the projects themselves. And it is an iterative process, right? So there's ongoing communication with the proponent. And, as we like to talk about between both the political and the corporation, if we're going to see these projects go forward, we'd rather be part of it. So that we can have influence, again, going back to that whole, the concept of ESG, and that's the social and that governance and that environmental piece, that we can help influence that, right? We've even had discussions, and I can't mention the group, but of having membership on the board from our community. So you're at the highest level of those governance pieces, right? We're in discussions with groups about having equity participation. So we've got ownership. All of that, I think, is quite progressive. It is risk, but it does mean that from an oversight standpoint, we've got a real voice in that. So that's sort of what takes place between YKDFN and Det'on as the corporation. No, we don't unilaterally just make moves or speak on their behalf. It's done in parallel. I'm now going to sort of expose myself a little bit here, and I'll make a statement as Paul Gruner, so not as Det'on or YKDFN, but again, something around that ESG piece, and it's something I'm personally very passionate about. And having some experiences internationally, I would like to see NWT, the North in Canada, being part of that resource sector in a fashion that we are overseeing it from an environmental standpoint. We have fair wages, etc. I do get concerned, when we talk about a green restart and renewable energy, and I love all of that. I'm personally very invested in all of that. But if we're sourcing those raw inputs from countries or jurisdictions that don't have the same environmental, social governance oversights, are we not just more of the same problem? And to a certain degree, are we not then a modern form of colonialism in itself? So I think it's really important and critical that we make sure that the raw inputs, and what better way to do that by having oversight from our own backyard, are done in an ethical fashion.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Next on the list, I have Ms. Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Gruner for the presentation. I'm excited by the things that Mr. Gruner brought up as far as development interests, mineral sector, tourism, infrastructure, business or private sector growth. I think that's something that Mr. Gruner would find a lot of company on those items from many members of the 19th Assembly. But I feel like we can't talk about the economy without talking about the COVID landscape that we're in right now. If I think back to when I was first elected in 2019, and I think to the conversations that I had with business owners, there was a lot of hope and a lot of excitement at that time. And when I have conversations with the business owners today, there is definitely a change in that sentiment. And the change that has happened is a lot of business owners are feeling exhaustion and defeat today. When I think of the number of businesses that I served in 2019 versus today, that number has definitely changed here in Cam Lake for sure. And I think that that's something that can be felt throughout the NWT. And so I'm wondering if Mr. Gruner can speak to what role he feels the GNWT plays, and also in the COVID landscape today, what barriers Mr. Gruner sees to the success of the NWT, because there was a lot of hope. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for the North to get back to that point. But I think that there are barriers and questions that need to be answered before we can truly get to our full success. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Gruner.
Good question, Caitlin. Yeah. Again, personal experiences. I can honestly say I'm feeling fatigue, and in speaking with other leaders, whether they be in the Indigenous space or not, there's a lot of fatigue out there for sure. Hope is sort of declining. I can again speak for myself. I feel the same way. I hate to admit that. We put a lot of energy and time within Det'on around just working with our folks from a mental health perspective, because we're feeling that within our ranks, not just the folks that are running, but all through the corporations that are feeling those challenges and those pinch, right? So I think that's a very real concern. And what can we do about it? Well, it goes back to the Emerging Strongly plan. Make a real plan. That's not a plan. It's that could have been boiled down to a nice brochure, to be honest with you. There's nothing there. And really, it's a bit of a mirror of what the 19th Assembly mandate was, right? So we have to get very tactile. Like there's a difference between strategic and tactile, right? Having your long-term strategy, and we've mapped that out for Det'on, so we've got a 10-year plan, and now we're really filling in the gaps on the tactile. and taking that very, very seriously. Because again, we've got hundreds of people that are at risk, not just YKDFN members, but non, right? We take that very, very seriously, right? When you start becoming an employer, the size and magnitude that we are, it's not just about your own people. There's people that really depend on you day in and day out to put food on the table, to look after their folks, make their mortgage payments, you name it, right? And I think from a mental health perspective, and I'm certainly no psychologist, but when you start removing hope from the equation, I think that's when the mental health piece becomes really, really concerning. And we have to adapt. COVID isn't going anywhere, so we made some calls. We got lucky, I think, in terms of government funding when we could get, move the Vitale boarding home, and that solved a bit of a COVID problem. So that's awesome. But those were multiple stakeholders in government coming together to work with industry, private sector. Cool. So, we know we can do it, but we can't just close ourselves off behind a wall, because we will get leapfrogged. I was just in the Yukon a few weeks ago, and the place is booming. Like I said, I met with the president of, for the hotels for the territory. You can't get a room, can't get a rental car, and they've never had a better northern viewing season than they're having right now. Same thing for getting in contractors, etc. They're making things happening. They're adapting. They're being progressive on it. And I think something to keep in mind. And again, I'm not a health expert by any means, but Yukon for the most part has had to sort of continue to stay operating because of its close proximity to Alaska. That is the route to get to Alaska, and they've continued that throughout COVID. And I'm not saying it didn't have its challenges, but they were able to navigate that for the most part with minimal downside. We saw that outbreak that took place 3-4 weeks ago. I'm not sure if anybody here there's I think it's CTV that has the COVID tracker. I don't know if you guys have seen that. If you haven't, look it up. It's daily. NWT a few weeks ago was the second worst per capita in North America. And when everybody was freaking out about Alberta and how devastating it was, at that time, we were 4 to 5 times multiple worse than what Alberta was. So those are facts. Those are stats. So what we're doing, I would raise a bit of a question. Is it as effective as it could be? And I think the other side of it is adaptability. Have a plan, make it tactile, make it real, and let's build something that we're going to have, 10 years plus down the road. Because right now, to your point, Caitlin, in terms of quote unquote hope, it's a bit challenging right now for sure. And we're feeling that across the board.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. Cleveland.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Mr. Gruner for being raw and for being candid, because I think that people need to hear honest answers to questions like that right now. And I think that part of building our hope and regaining that is being honest with where we are right now. And so I appreciate that. And I want to thank Mr. Gruner for his honesty. My next question is about hope. And I find that one of the things that is providing some hope right now and some momentum in the North is around housing. We're seeing an influx of dollars from the federal government. We're seeing a spotlight being put on housing and its importance, especially in northern communities, especially in the light of a pandemic. And so from a very difficult first question, I want to, shift to a question about successes and about hope. And so I'm wondering if Mr. Gruner can speak to some housing successes that he has seen with his experience both in leadership roles and in working with debt corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Mr. Gruner.
Almost learned on that one, sorry. I will nail this by the end, I promise. So I think I'm really excited about our housing initiative right now. Now we have to execute. So it's great. We can announce $18 million for a housing initiative. We now have to execute. So, I talk about execution. That's up to us too. That's on us. I'll go back into my Yukon days a little bit. And what I'm really, really proud of, in terms of the supply chain for housing, right? So when I was at Dakwakata Capital Investments, So Castle Rock Enterprises, is anybody familiar with Whistle Bend in Whitehorse? So Whistle Bend would be sort of our equivalency of Niven, right? That's sort of the largest, and they're building that out block by block. Castle Rock Enterprises was the main contractor that built out the key infrastructure. So lot clearing, underground, deep water, shallow, utilities, paving, you name it, right? We did that. 100% Indigenous owned. Most of the windows and doors, when you look at across any new builds, we weren't the cheapest, but we were the most highly energy efficient and high quality. 100% Indigenous owned was RAB Energy, and those were windows and doors. We actually had a quad pane window, the most energy efficient window in North America. Also incredibly soundproof, heavy, very heavy, but manufactured right in Whitehorse. Killridge Enterprises. Killridge is a industrial supplier of much of the commercial and housing that takes place in Whitehorse and across the territory. That one is also 100% Indigenous owned by various Indigenous shareholders, stakeholders. So, and now you're seeing, when you look at downtown Whitehorse, so Northern Visions Development Corporation, NVD, folks are familiar with that. They own a lot of the real estate development that's taking place downtown, a lot of the hotels. There's approximately 40-50% of the capital of NVD is Indigenous from Yukon. And then you're seeing now a whole emerging economy being developed. So I sit on the board of another corporation operating in Whitehorse, and we're involved in several housing projects. And as a result of the Indigenous procurement strategy that they have, they're now involved in several $100 million worth of revenue in the next number of years, spurred on because of that Indigenous procurement. So those are some great successes. That comes from before my time here, and through some of my governance work still back in Yukon, and keeping in touch with things like that. But things are happening, huge amounts of Indigenous inclusion. The question I'd ask everybody here: does anybody know what the Indigenous population of Yukon is? Open-ended question.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner.
About
Ms.
25%.
Sorry, what was that?
About 25%.
That is absolutely correct, Mr. O'Reilly. And we have a 52% population in NWT. Why is Yukon having some of that progressive and that much inclusion from the Indigenous side, and we have doubled the Indigenous percentage of our population here in the territory?
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Ms. Cleveland, anything else?
No, thank you very much for that, Mr. Chair. Are you saying, can I get a third question in there?
No, just saying you did a really good job today. Mr. Johnson, you're next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for presenting. I'm always excited to hear about Det'on's work. I think, the Cheetah mining project, although small, is probably one of the most exciting projects in the world right now. I think, all the mining logistics work is super exciting. I'm really happy about buying the Slave Lake Inn, and I'm really looking forward to the name change. But I think, no surprise, I want to ask you about, I'm happy to see that fifth bullet point of the commercial leasing. As you are well aware, NWT gives Northview $20 million a year, and they own our town. And it is my dream, too, that one day, some of those buildings will say Det'on Show, and some of that money will stay here. Can I just, this is one of those areas where I think I finally got some agreement out of the minister, but we're getting down into tactile kind of lease negotiations and how we make this work. And I would welcome any insight you have and what the barrier is to actually get that transferred over to, DevCorps and into local ownership. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Gruner.
Yeah, great question. Ryland, I know you and I have had some discussions about this, and I share your passion around that. Again, it goes back to that whole concept of the circular economy. The more we can sort of keep here, the better off that we are. I may or may not have had a conversation with the minister about some of these files and sort of asked the question, what do you prefer? Do you prefer being in front of the press, getting hammered about how that's a Southern REIT, or do you think it'd be a better PR to talk about how you've got Indigenous groups that are owning that and we're keeping it local, right? There's a good news story that's waiting to happen, guys, for sure, right? How do we go about doing that? One of the biggest components that everybody has to remember here is the concept of risk, right? Respectively, and half my household income is GNWT. Government has to worry about spending. The private sector, including the Det'on shows of the world, have to worry about our inflows or our revenue first before we worry about spending in the bottom line dollar. We have to have those inflows first, and that's risk. So when we look at whether it be commercial real estate or doing something like soon to be name change Slave Lake Inn, Island, we've got to have those sort of what we like is those longer term contracts, asset backed. And then we can go out and finance, well, pretty much anything, right? There are financing vehicles that we can take advantage of, First Nations Finance Authority, et cetera. There are opportunities for us to do that. But in order for us to do that, those long-term contracts, which reduces risk and exposure, is what's required, right? And thinking a little bit strategically about it. So if we're talking about a 5 to 10 year lease, it's not going to do. We have to have something that's going to be longer, that when we're dealing with the financiers, and especially when you're talking about a GNWT or a federal governments, those are going to be the best backers of those leases we could possibly have, right? And so the longer term that we can drive those leases out, the better off we are. They've done some creative stuff in Yukon. Please don't quote me on this, because I think it was Carcross. And they were building the cultural center there. And I think that was a multi-million dollar build. In order to help finance that, they worked with the federal government for a one-time lease payment. So what they said was, okay, I think it was parks. They leased out 10 years or 15 years or what it was. They paid up front. And then they were able to use that as part of their financing agreement. To get that threshold they require to get the rest of the capital. So a great example of being a bit creative, de-risking a project, and working with multiple stakeholders to bring that forward, right? I think there's ways that we can do that with the commercial real estate downtown, right? Now, when you deal with conventional and non-conventional financing, typically to do a commercial real estate deal like that, you're going to need 30 to 40% down. So using rough numbers, that commercial real estate square footage downtown is probably 110 million, thereabouts, roughly. So 30-40%, you're looking at $30 to $40 million that's required. Then you can sort of finance the rest through conventional financing at that sort of 2 to 3.5, well, 2.5 to 3.5, 4% interest rate, right, for commercial. Well, I don't know about you guys, but we don't have 30, 40 million. It's the weirdest thing. So then you have to enter in, so you can still do it, but then you have to enter into non-conventional financing vehicles. And it can be up to and including things like what they call mezzanine debt, right? And mezz debt can be that 8 to 10% or higher, right? I've heard it as high as 16, 18%. Well, never a good business model because those margins can be tighter if you're trying to finance 30, 40% on your credit card and then your conventional financing. And that can really end up jeopardizing these projects. So that's where you've got to reduce that up front because nobody has that 30, 40 million sort of just out there ready to deploy into one project. We've got to get that down to a minimal amount, increase that lease term as long as possible, and then you can maximize your conventional financing and you can make the project work.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. Johnson?
No further questions on that. No, that's really Paul. And I've had these conversations with the minister, and I'll continue to. I just think there's nothing but potential that, I have no issue signing a 20-year lease. It seems if you project the next 20 years without doing anything like that, it's just going to be, we're rolling over those Northview leases year after year. So I think this is just an area we got to get down into the logistics. But any further comment you got on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the one challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Gruner.
Oh, sorry. The one challenge we do have on that and the feedback we've heard back, Ryland, is the departments will operate independent of each other. And all of a sudden now, how do you go and it's like herding cats, multiple departments and figuring out what their long-term lease requirements are, et cetera. And now you've frustrated the process, right? So it really has to be something where GNWT takes a leadership role and says, we need this percentage of square footage for 15, 20 years, to your point, right? We'll commit to that, with an escalator for inflation, et cetera. Now you're de-risking that, right? If you're having to go and work across multiple departments and each department working independent of each other, it's never going to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. O'Reilly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to Mr. Gruner, and congratulations on the purchase of the Slave Lake Inn. I do look forward to a name change, but then I think there's some great potential there, and with the housing market as well throughout Yellowknife. So, but what I want to ask Paul about is, before I became an MLA, I spent a lot of time on closure planning for at least one of the diamond mines from an environmental perspective. But I don't really see much, if any, work being done on the socioeconomic side. Diavik is going to close maybe in 3 to 5 years. Who knows where Acadi's really going? But there's just really nothing being done in terms of that socioeconomic transition that I'm aware of. So would like to get his views on what sort of macro planning can and should be done with regard to that reality. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Gruner.
Thanks. That's a great question, Kevin. And so from a corporate standpoint, on one side, it's awesome to say, hey, we're one of the largest private employers of local people in the territory, and look at us. That's great, right? The other side is it's all downside. And that's the grim reality, right? So when our leadership asks us, or even other sort of key stakeholders, what are you going to do about it, right? Full disclosure, I don't have an answer. And that's not good. If your president CEO doesn't have an answer, I'm not doing my job, right? But the reality of it is you get to a certain point that you can't just fabricate or make things happen, if that makes sense. You have to have something to move or pivot to. And we don't. So like I said, we are going to take full advantage of the reclamation economy for sure. We've done our own analysis on it. We feel that we can bridge that. It may not be the same level of economic opportunity that we've experienced, but we'll survive. There's some housing initiatives that we'll take advantage of, et cetera. Again, full disclosure, we almost bought a couple of hotels a couple of years ago in the tourism space. You have any idea how screwed we'd be today if we did that? Oh my goodness. So, I mean, the grim reality of it is, you're right. We need to start really looking at what is the long term, and quite frankly, we should have been doing that long before this. And that's my personal views. I don't see how the resource economy doesn't play a part in the long-term NWT economic outlook, because there's nothing that can fill that gap, especially 10 years out. We've mapped it for Det'on Cho. I can tell you we've got the sort of the 2030 plan, as you will, and that comes from financial debt repayment back to conventional, our First Nation, employment, et cetera. But we've got a cliff coming at 2030, and that's Det'on Cho. That mirrors the territory, right? We're the canary in the coal mine, and we see exactly what's going to be coming. And again, it's a step function as Diavik comes down and this one comes down, et cetera, and you build in your various assumptions within your model. You've got to have something that can backfill and fill that in, and we simply don't have it, right? So it goes back to, what do we see? That slide in terms of the key drivers or for the economy ourselves. It's the resource sector, so having something that's sustainable. Again, having very real conversations about that. It's going to take 3 or so mines per diamond mine that's those shut down, conventional mines. You're going to have new technology coming into those mines, so they become more automated, AI, et cetera. I sit on the Future Skill Center Canada board, which is a federal. We're looking at all these things about a changing, shifting economy and what the labor force is going to need. We have to have real conversations about the fact that we've got a 40% graduation rates in our communities. And as those technological advances in that sector increases, that's going to reduce the amount of opportunities. We have to get in front of that. We know tourism can be a driver, but we know that it often will not pay to the level to sustain, required lifestyle in the territory. And I will absolutely stand behind that we need to continue to push and develop strategic infrastructure projects that are not only stimulating the economy at the time, but are going to be revenue generating going forward to build the next phase of the economy.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the answer. I don't want to dip too far into the content of what that plan might look like, but I think we both agree that there needs to be some kind of process to start to do some of that work. But I guess one part of the economy I really haven't heard a lot about is the knowledge economy. And I know that, Paul, you talked a little bit about that in terms of the Center of Excellence for Indigenous business. And I think that's probably something that can and should be one of the focuses of the Polytechnic University. But do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of contribution you think the knowledge economy, could make or should make, and the Polytechnic is part of that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Gruner?
Thank you. That's a great question, Kevin. So I think, when we look at the knowledge economy, so again, it comes down to having those real conversations, right? First and foremost.
Just lock up? Mr. Gruner, are you there?
Oh, can you hear me? You can hear me, right? I think we might have lost Jackie.
Yes, we can. Just go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So again, personal views. So please take it for what it is. I think the knowledge economy can't work it cannot be independent of other industries. It's a whole lot easier to build a knowledge economy when you've got other economies like mining. So whether you like or dislike the sector in Alberta, what they found is that knowledge that's come from the energy sector services. So if you are somebody that can work online, can work remotely, where are you going to work? You want to work in Yellowknife or in one of the communities at -50, or do you want to be in Vancouver, California, what have you, right? Even Yukon, who's been at this for many years, ask them and have a very real conversation about their quote-unquote knowledge economy. They're doing some interesting things around creative spaces, etc., but it is not anywhere near a key driver of their economy or a GDP contributor. It's just not, right? So again, it goes back to the ROI, the return on investment. Are you getting the dollars back in terms of the money that you're spending on it? And I would say that money well spent is going to be around that capacity building and working with Indigenous groups across the territory to build the capacity to conduct real business. And you tie that to your Indigenous, procurement. You bring in your government programs for training, development, and capacity building, and you bring in your Indigenous Business Center of Excellence, 3 pillars. So you create the opportunity, you build the capacity, and you reduce the cost to operate. And now it goes beyond the contracts. They learn and start to figure out how to build those microeconomies in their communities. And you build out more Det'on shows and more Tlalit shows. And within that starts to become your knowledge economy. And you can overcome, I think, a bit of that gap on that 40% graduation rate that we face in those communities. The college has to play a part in that, but we cannot turn our back on the secondary school system either.
Thank you, Mr. Gruner. Mr. O'Reilly, I was cut off there. Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah, Mr. O'Reilly.
No, it was great. I really appreciate the chance to meet with Mr. Gruner here today. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Hearing or seeing no other questions for Mr. Gruner, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Gruner, for joining us here today. This concludes our public portion of our meeting. So thank you, Mr. Gruner.
Masi Cho. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me one-on-one. I'm easy to find. I'm very passionate about all of these topics, and it's only going to take all of us. It comes down to a rising tide lifts all boats, and we're not going to get there if we don't do it all together. Masi Cho.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gruner. Have a good day. Madam
Cheers.
Clerk. Yeah, Madam Clerk, this concludes our public portion of the meeting. If